Hi, I'm Eric Durek, and welcome to MedHealthFit Commentary. Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at fake news. Most of us, when we discuss here on MedHealthFit, we deal with issues of wellness and healthcare. Issues of news and information that's on the internet versus what you watch on TV has a lot to do with your health. So let's begin. I recently read a report in Science regarding the spread of fake news on the internet and what the academic profession is doing in order to stop it. The latest round of news fixing comes from the California State Legislature, who is proposing a bill to vet social media news stories from commentators and to see what elements are fake news or not. It's an interesting proposition, but I want to drill down as to what may constitute fake news in the first place. So let's take a brief history of news time. With the recent death of physicist Stephen Hawking, the world lost perhaps one of the last great scientific minds. When we think of science, we're told that it's one of the more noble professions, something that young students can strive to do besides honing their skills on other pursuits such as music or literature or even auto shop. We'll go back to the turn of the last century when all news came from regional and local newspapers. A quick scan of some of the early brands of news revealed that they have a bias based on their location, who's writing them, and the content that's within their pages. The New York Union, the Daily Ohio Statesman, or Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper are all examples of biased newspapers that were actually written during the time of local news muckraking and double-checking of one's sources. Not really. One of my favorites at the time was William Randolph Hearst, who acquired the New York Journal from his father George in the early 1900s and started a news war with Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. Of course, Hearst was well known for his brand of newspaper reporting, and he probably would have been considered one of the early proponents of fake news, as decried by Orson Welles in the movie Citizen Kane. And I quote, "People believe what I'll tell them to believe," unquote. Sounds like fake news to me. The main characteristics of a Hearst newspaper included, according to writer Ray Setterfield, scare headlines, the use of visual and sometimes graphic photos, fake interviews, Sunday comics, and a sympathy for the underdog. These are the early hallmarks of fake news that we know today. Thanks, William. Of course, in the 1960s came movie magazines and the National Enquirer, which most people knew was trash journalism, but they read it anyway, especially when some celebrity gossip was brewing. It all goes to show that what the minority of people think may be fake news is what the majority of people actually choose to read. Magazines today, such as Us and People, are big sellers at the grocery store, and they compete with the Enquirer for tabloid stories. So most of our brief history of news time is really a history of the types of stories that sell newspapers and magazines, not so much the most well-respected and the most true types of stories. And that's only what was in print. The story of the big newspapers looked into some top reporters such as Walter Winchell, who did report on events during the Roaring '20s, the Prohibition, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The early 20th century became more involved with information. And as more people learned to read, and thus the appetite for news stories, both true and false, became more a part of the American fabric. American authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald painted a true picture of American life, whereby most saw the opulence from newspapers. The reality was that, like today, many people lived on the brink of poverty, one paycheck away, while the top 1% lived in luxury. It all came crashing down in 1929 with the Great Depression. Radio followed in the 1930s and TV in the 50s, which gave features to luminaries such as Edward R. Murrow and later Walter Cronkite. What distinguished these reporters was their ability to gather facts and report them to the American people. During this time period, it could be said that truth was the most important issue. What most people did not know was the political leanings of these reporters, which is not the case today. The rise of tabloid journalism became when I was growing up, and I saw these checkout aisles in the grocery stores which were inundated with Hollywood goings-on, alien abductions, and political hearsay. What people consider fake news on the internet is simply an offshoot from 40 years ago, when tabloid headlines were all the rage. Even before then, back in the 1930s, tabloids held the attention of persons at the newsstands, and the advent of these tabloids came into full swing. So what's today's fake news? much of what's being stated around today's fake news, from the President of the US decrying that specific news outlets that don't agree with his views are fake, to specific types of trends in social media. Since over 40% of Americans and a higher percentage of youth receive their news from online sources, the credibility of internet news stories and stories of this comes into question. This rises from left to right political spectrums such as MSN, The Young Turks, RT.com, Breitbart, Alex Jones, and InfoWars, and Abby Martin. All of these outlets have their following, and each of them have a specific degree of credibility depending on your political leanings. The issue of InfoWars being fake has more to do with the raving dialogues of the commentator Alex Jones than all the information that he's actually putting out. There are many who are convinced that he is on the cusp of a national news story, but his credibility has recently come into question big time, not just because of the topics he covered, but because of his delivery style. The area of health and healthcare has also come into question in the past decade. In discussing fake news versus censorship, the real issue here may not be what defines fake news, but the rise of the suppression of alternative thoughts. There are a number of websites, social media groups, and concerned parents who are all opposed to issues such as vaccines. These are credible concerns, as the U.S. government has unveiled a 1986 vaccine law to help parents who have had vaccine-injured children. There are thousands and thousands of cases each year that are dealt with the NVIAC. This was put into place because of the rising amount of tort claims against vaccine manufacturers. The response to these concerns over the past decade from reporters online to national news shows is one of disdain, accusations, and fraud. The claim that injuries, autism, and chronic diseases from vaccines has been thoroughly debunked is both untrue and a slap in the face to a democratic society. The real issue here stems from the amount of ignorance and contempt that people really have for specific medical issues, particularly ones like vaccines. Like cigarette research before them, vaccines have had multiple safety issues, and manufacturers have been sued worldwide. They've committed perjury and fraud with their product, and they're trying to mandate vaccines in many areas. So when parents and concerned citizens cry foul, they're ostracized by the media, educators, and physicians, who, by the way, actually have a financial incentive to give more and more vaccines. Since there are now over 140 medical studies that link vaccines to autism alone, and hundreds more relating to chronic diseases, then why would we not move in the direction of finding the truth? Well, money for one. Vaccines represent a $55 billion industry, up from just a few $100 million 20 years ago. So if we follow the money, we see corrupt industries that are doing whatever they can to increase profits. Many believe in the face of increasing safety issues related to their products, and the truth. We've seen a barrage of fake news stories in the Middle East, most recently the bombing of chemical factories and sites in Syria, where the mainstream media is blaming President Assad, and other outlets such as McMurray are saying that the entire incident is a false flag operation designed to weed out specific information that may not be in the best interest of those who are writing the article in question. So who's right? And then there's the case of the internet's top fact-checking site, Snopes.com, which has come under fire in recent years due to the fact that the founder of this site, Mr. David Mickelson, was not able to respond to a query based on a confidentiality agreement. Ford's contributor Kaylee Litero says it's impossible to understate how antithetical this issue is to fact-checking world, in which absolute openness and transparency are necessary prerequisites for trust. How can a fact-checking organization like Snopes expect the public to trust them when they themselves are called into question? And the response is that they can't respond. So looking deep into the spectacle that is the fake news theorem, it's easy to see why the majority of people are trying to squeeze those with a dissenting viewpoint. This may be the rise of fascism, plain and simple. It will take a portion of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and discard it because they want everyone to think the way that they do. Congress is just as guilty as news outlets. They're funded by pharmaceuticals and large business interests, and they do not report the news the way that they should be. So in many cases, we have a complete conflict of interest between what may be reported in the news and what is actually being reported. So in conclusion, When we hear about fake news or we read about fake news on social media, we have to make a decision. Is the news actually fake, or is it just an alternative brand of news? This is Eric Durak for MedHealthFit Commentary. If you have any response to this, log into medhealthfit.com and let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.